there has been a change over the past couple of decades. It feels like in terms of like history and our understanding of that era. Would you give us sort of like, I don't know, the intellectual history development of this holiday and that history?
Yeah, I mean, so it is a holiday that is celebrated starting in 1866. It wanes in the late 19th century, but then begins to really pick up in the 60s in Texas, as well as Louisiana, and then some folks out in California, in part because of the way the Great Migration went west from Texas. And it gets a sort of revitalization in the late 20th century. But I didn't celebrate Juneteenth growing up at all. I was aware of Juneteenth programs here and there in Alabama, but really coastal further south. In Massachusetts, we celebrated Emancipation Day. We had Emancipation Day ceremonies, but never Juneteenth. So it's a recent, I think, sort of holiday of national recognition. And I do think, there's in some quarters, some appropriate skepticism of that, certainly from Texans who I know. But I think also it's sort of, there's a way in which it seems too easy particularly in this moment where we're experiencing so much sort of tension and conflict around the politics of race that in some ways it's like, it happened all of a sudden. I was sort of astonished.
It seemed to have come out of nowhere. I mean, like I don't, even as an adult, like I'm not even sure, even within the context of this show, which we've been doing for 12, 13 years, I don't think 12 years ago I had ever even heard the word Juneteenth.
Right. So I think the question is sort of how can we keep it from becoming something that is just a sort of empty symbol and actually use it as an occasion, particularly when we're in the midst of the culture wars and the cold civil war that we live in now. How do we allow it to be an occasion to be educated, but also to actually contest the refusal of the study of history and and the banning of books and the like?
Well, specifically that, I mean, in this moment of anti-critical race theory being this organizing force for the Republican Party, particularly on a local level, because they want to activate them to vote Republican. And if you're going to your school board and bitching about racism being taught in schools, you're probably going to vote. I mean, just talk about that importance too, because like the fact that this is such a new federal holiday and it's happening in this particular moment is key as well.
It is key. I mean, I think one of the ways that we might think about it is that in the context, and we can take Florida as always the easy example, but if there is a prohibition on teaching this history, you're actually you have in some ways a kind of Federalist crisis, right? A distinction, a sort of fundamental contestation between what is being celebrated on the federal level and what a state is insisting cannot be actually engaged historically at all. So you have from the White House the message, well, this is the second Independence Day, as it were, right? That Juneteenth celebrates the second Independence Day, and then you have at the state level people saying you absolutely cannot learn about this history. It's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, talk about that, the Juneteenth within the context of, like, because we're in an era, right, where we have also followed where a lot of the Confederate statues have come down. Fort Bragg is getting renamed. I mean, it's almost like there's a sort of, I don't know, a mirror image to the 20s in the 1920s or the early 1920s or 19 teens, where we've come out of Reconstruction and there's this resurgence of the KKK and all of these memorials start going up, and there's an attempt to sort of establish the lost cause and to create a new revision of history. And now we sort of like a century later, there is I guess the apparatus that controls or has more of a grip around history is like sort of pushing back on that, right? I mean, we're getting rid of the Dunning School as an interpretation of what happened, and but there is a huge blowback to that I don't know if there was a parallel to in those teens, because there wasn't an empowered sort of political force or cultural force at the time to complain about, like, hey, why are you putting up a statue of a Confederate general when, 40 years ago or 60 years ago, they were trying to overthrow the government? Like, what's going on here?
Right. I mean, what's interesting is that this is why, it's a fascinating era. So one of the consequences of digitization is that we have access to sort of vast numbers of Black newspapers from the 1920s. So there's a really robust conversation happening about the evil of the lost cause and the violence behind it, right? And so it's not recognized in the mainstream, but there is the conversation that's happening. And in some ways, the culture wars cycle every 30 years. I am increasingly of the mind that the way that we teach the history is not simply, this should be the master narrative of the nation or the consensus narrative, or that should be, but that it's actually the history, the story is the conflict, right? That there has been this sort of fundamental conflict from the very founding of the nation over who ought to count as citizens, over what the scope of membership is, over the recognition of human rights, of civil rights, and the like, and that's really the story, right? So the lost cause, the sort of the motif, the South shall rise again, repeats itself because we have this core ideological conflict, and that is part of the American story.
So if American history is these sort of like two major competing narratives that at various times and the story of our history is a product of that dynamic at any given time, where one narrative may have more the more cultural, like, what is it that when we look at that dynamic, like, what is it that we're saying that the narrative has? Like, are there components of society that, one narrative has captured for this particular era as opposed to the other narrative? Is it all just simply political power? Is there cultural power to it? I mean, I hate to refer to Charlie Kirk, but this segment we just played so laid out all of these issues, but from, a guy who wasn't quite, I think, conscious of the issues, but sort of reacting to them in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the narratives have beliefs behind them. And there's something instructive that one narrative wants to limit what people know in order to sustain the belief. And the other actually, at best, is encourages deeper investigation, right? And so the sort of anti-intellectualism, the anti-education disposition of the sort of lost cause idea, I think the way that, that those of us who believe in history and believe in truth and justice respond is to say, what are you so afraid of people knowing, right? But I do think, so I think it's political, and I think it has to do with power, but it also has to do with belief systems, right? At a very core level, right? And not just, we bandy about words like democracy, but the idea is what I think behind is what's the precondition for democracy, right? And the precondition for democracy is on a certain level, this question of who do you believe gets to participate, right? What are the conditions of participation? It's not just democracy isn't just the procedure, right? It's actually how do we get to the voting booth or whatever, or what have you, or the table, as it were. And so, so I think it's a combination in many ways of all of the things that you said.
I feel that it's immensely important that moments like this act as mythbusters too, because so much of like the white power structure wants to mythologize like the founding of this nation. It's the whole 1776 project nonsense, revisionist history, and why I feel this is, a more opportune moment than, say, Martin Luther King Day, where I feel like a massive section of the population has deified or like defanged him as well at the same time. This is much more of an opportunity to analyze that conflict that you describe and the ongoing nature of it, as opposed to presenting a figurehead and then saying, well, you know, this person solved this, and then, okay, let's wash our hands of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, to the extent that, you know, because Juneteenth is new, it becomes an occasion to have a debate around it. I am also of the mind of, you know, telling the truth about Dr. King and using, I think, and it's a really wonderful example that you give, though, because the way that he gets mythologized and actually defanged is by the taking of a sound bite. And I think similarly, you know, the way that there are some folks talk about Juneteenth, you know, as though it has no political content, has the potential of having that same kind of, you know, kind of flattening of the legacy. And so, I do believe we can have this discussion around Juneteenth, and I hope that it encourages us to actually reevaluate all of the holidays, right? Reevaluate the Federalist Papers, you know, it becomes an occasion to think differently about our past.
What is the way to sort of like maximize that utility? I mean, Charlie Kirk called this a neo-segregationist holiday. And that it was, I mean, the thing is, though, there was the way that he approached it was really fascinating to me, because he said it was meant to undercut July 4th. And I think on a sort of like an ideological, like intellectual level, that's an interesting sort of like thing to discuss, because Frederick Douglass's famous speech about like, this is not, you know, it's Independence Day, but it's not. But then he sort of turned it into, just because of its close proximity in time to July 4th, that instead of it being sort of like a way to undercut the, to make July 4th more of a process day than a sort of, this is when we got, you know, our liberation. But how, so on some level, I think like he's helping the utility of Juneteenth to, you know, essentially make Americans look into their history and understand their country more. I don't think he meant to do that, but for those who don't perceive it as a neo-segregationist holiday, but rather one about, you know, have a more nuanced and an ability, you know, to have an awareness of what this country was sort of founded on and how long of a process it's been, and we're not there yet. I mean, how do we leverage that utility?
I mean, I think that you just offered a perfect example. Growing up, I was expected to read What to the Slave is the 4th of July, right? And the idea that and Independence Day, the 4th of July was a widely celebrated holiday in Black communities. Any day that's a day off for people who are hardworking